Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Lyndon Johnson Foundation, I welcome all of you to the 2009 Harry Middleton Lecture. And I might say this is the inaugural event of this beautifully redone auditorium. So we're all enjoying it together at the same time. The Harry Middleton Lecture was established by Lady Bird Johnson in 1994 to honor the longtime director of the LBJ Library. And what a lecture series it has been. The first Harry Middleton Lecture was former President Jimmy Carter. He was followed 2 years later by former President Gerald Ford. Other Middleton presenters have included journalists Bill Moyers and Brian Williams, Nobel laureate Stephen Weinberg, award-winning playwright David Mamet, and former Los Angeles Times publisher and CNN president Tom Johnson. In between, we have had presentations on this very stage of Clarence Darrow and Ernest Hemingway. Simply put, the Harry Middleton Lecture has become as renowned and as acclaimed as the person for whom it is named, who is uniformly acknowledged as the best presidential library director ever. This year's Middleton Lecture is clearly the right addition to the pantheon of illustrious Harry Middleton lecturers. I could give you a biographical introduction of Tom Brokaw. I could tell you of all of the steps of his journey to the pinnacle of broadcast journalism. I could say that he has won every major award and recognition available to his profession, some of them multiple times. While all of that is true, neither the successes nor the awards are the best measure or the right identifier of this extraordinary man. When I was a boy growing up, Edward R. Murrow was important to me. He was a voice I trusted, telling me what I needed to know about the way the world worked. A generation later, there were thousands of boys and girls, and yes, men and women, across this land giving the same attentive allegiance to Tom Brokaw. He is in the tradition of the great ones, the Murrows and the Cronkites, who have defined and set the standards for American broadcast journalism. He has given us, in a voice we believed in, the honest first draft of the passing history of the eventful time we live in. He has been the gold standard. Then he has gone on to write about our time. With his books on the greatest generation, Mr. Brokaw immortalized the men and women who once were young and are now passing into folklore, who survived a Great Depression and saved the nation with their service and sacrifice in a great world war, and then returned to build this great country. In Boom, Voices of the 60s, he captured for posterity the voice, the violent, angry, and hopeful voice of the violent, angry, and hopeful decade of the 1960s. He is a towering figure of our time, a leader who has made history by reporting it honestly and recording and preserving it with care and respect. We are honored to have him with us tonight to deliver the 2009 Harry Middleton Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tom Brokaw.
Thank you all very, very much. I am very flattered indeed. I am privileged to be in your midst in this great library honoring one of the towering figures of American public life, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I like coming to Texas generally, and I like particularly coming to Austin, although I must confess to you that I have had to pay a penalty of sorts over the past couple of years because, truth in advertising here, I have a son-in-law who's a boomer sooner. And so I have this hook'em horn circle of friends that always lure me into some kind of a wager every year. And I have now positioned on my desk, staring at me, a bobble-headed Longhorns doll and the University of Texas cap that I had to position right over my word processor because that was part of the terms of the bet. And every day when I go to sit down, I have to look up at this hook'em horns cap that has inscribed on it, "Where national champs get used to it, Coach Brown." So I know the kind of competitive environment that I enter into when I come to the University of Texas. Let me also say at the outset, I'm really very flattered to be here, especially when I realize that for $2 million, you could have had a junior executive of AIG as your speaker here today. I'm at that unusual small club of former anchormen, a very tiny club. One of your fellow Texans, Dan Rather, who has a home not too far from here, obviously is also a member of that fraternity. But the godfather of us all is still Walter Cronkite, going not as strong as we'd like him to, but in his 90s now, still very actively interested in what's going on in the world, a very proud man. And what I always thought was kind of a shame was that throughout Walter's career, the rest of the country didn't get to know his peerless wife, Betsy Cronkite. The Johnson family obviously knows the Cronkite family well. And they know, just as Mrs. Johnson was so important to her husband, how important Betsy was to Walter. In large part because she knew just how, in Walter's case, how to let the air out of him at the right time. They met when they were cub reporters on the Kansas City Star, and the rest of us always counted on Betsy for the kind of withering line of the night. My favorite, however, occurred a couple of years ago, and it became a kind of template in our own family for how wives keep us, who occupy these jobs, on a common track. If there is an oxymoron in American life, it is the phrase humble anchorman. It just doesn't exist. Walter and Betsy were at the Yellowstone National Park, where Walter had been narrating a documentary for the Yellowstone Park Foundation. And when he finished his work, he was in the line at the gift shop at the Old Faithful Inn, and there was a woman standing behind Walter, and standing behind that woman was Betsy Cronkite. Now, the woman is just overcome with curiosity. She keeps looking at this very familiar figure in front of her, and finally, she couldn't contain herself anymore, and she tapped him on the shoulder. And Walter Cronkite turned around, and the woman said to him, "Has anyone ever told you you look just like Walter Cronkite did before he died?" Well, with that, Walter began to clear his throat and harump a little bit and look for some relief. Now the woman's in a mild panic. She turns to the woman behind her, not knowing who it is, and says to Betsy Cronkite, "Walter Cronkite is dead, isn't he?" And Betsy looked off for a moment, looked back at the woman, smiled, said, "You know, if he isn't by now, the old boy probably ought to be." In my case, I've often said, when people have asked me, since my wife and I have been married for almost 47 years now and known each other since we were 15, they said, "What is it like to grow up in a small town in South Dakota and then make your way all the way to New York, where you become the network anchorman of a very familiar figure in homes across America? How does Meredith adjust to that?" And I say, well, when I get home at night, Meredith remembers what it is that I do for a living. I'm always very pleased because she has her own life and her own interests, her own career, her own books that she's written, her own very successful retailing shop in New York, Penny Whistle Toys, and then her work with public television and conservation environmental causes. And she's really never gotten involved in my career until I made the decision to step down from nightly news and to not retire, but to shift gears, to not have to be in the same place every night at 6:30. And about the time I made the decision, we went out for dinner in a new restaurant in our neighborhood in New York, and Meredith for the first time looked at me and said, "I wonder if you thought through the idea that you're going to leave nightly news and the new life that you're going to have." And I said, "Well, yes, I think I have. Why would you bring that up?" She said, "Because you've gotten awfully used to all the perks that come with being the anchor of nightly news. You get theater tickets on short notice, you get a very good table in a hot new restaurant, you get invited to big events to sit on the front row at World Series games or NBA All-Star games, you get to travel to the Olympics whenever you'd like to go. I think that's probably going to go away now that you're stepping down." Well, with typical anchorman hubris, I said, "I don't think so. I think I've developed a certain amount of momentum that will carry forward." And Meredith looked at me in that cool, analytical way and said, "I don't think you can count on that. I think people are nice to you now because you do have the power, and when you step down from that desk, that will go away, and a lot of this attention will as well." Just as I was about to respond to her, the waiter came over to our table, and he began gushing over me, saying how thrilled they all were in the restaurant that we were there that night. They had just opened, and they had no idea that we would be coming in for dinner. I sat back and raised my wine glass and took a sip and looked at Meredith as if to say, "Listen to this." And the waiter went on some more, and he finally turned and he said, "I've asked the entire kitchen staff to come to the window of the kitchen doors so they can see you, because, Mr. Koppel, we watch you every night on ABC." I thought it might be helpful, with all due respect to the man whose name this great lecture bears, if I had not so much a lecture tonight, Mr. Middleton, but more of a conversation, a dialogue, if you will. As I've been going across America for the last 2 years now, I've been trying to generate a conversation among citizens. Wherever people live, whatever they do, whatever they believe politically or spiritually, whatever their hopes and aspirations are, I think we've lost something that's kind of special in American life. That we are not talking to each other across the lines anymore. We have retreated, if you will, to comfort zones and to areas of special interest. And we've invested all of our psychic and intellectual and political interest in advancing those more narrow causes. And I think that this great democracy has paid a penalty for that. And now we find ourselves at a time when we're going through a historic passage, a great test in America, a reordering not just of our economy, but of our place in the world. I've been collecting little sayings that kind of sum up where we are. Some of them are amusing but very telling. Warren Buffett likes to say, "You know who's swimming naked when the tide goes out." Rahm Emanuel, the president's chief of staff, says, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." And Jeff Immelt, my boss at General Electric, sent a message to all the NBC GE employees last fall when things were quite dark, saying this is not a cycle, it's a reset. And I do believe it is a reset. We have an opportunity now at the beginning of the 21st century to take stock of who we are as a country, to re-examine our political culture, to redefine our short-term and long-term goals, to begin to listen to one another and not just talk at each other in a way that will serve all of us well. We won't always land in the same place, nor should we. But we should work very hard, all of us, commonly and individually, to reintroduce the idea of civility back into our political dialogue, across the spectrum, from the left to the right and back again, so that young people, especially, can come of age knowing that the great strength of this immigrant nation has always been, then when we're faced with what appear to be insurmountable challenges, we rise as a nation to be more than the sum of our parts. And we do that by finding common cause. Let me offer, if you will, a place to begin that cross-cultural dialogue, that healing of the wounds, that bridging of the divisions that exist in America. It's a simple place, I think, but profoundly important. As we gather here in this magnificent library paying tribute to this great president, a man who dedicated his life to public service, and go out at the end of this evening into the early springtime, beautiful clean air of Boston, and think about the promise of the month of April and May. Young men and young American women, your fellow citizens, at this hour, are watching the dawn come up over the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan. We're hearing the call to prayer in Baghdad and Mosul and the other cities of Iraq. They're putting on Kevlar vests and their helmets, and they're locking and loading their weapons. They're going out into strange alleyways for a duty for which they are paid a modest price and pay a very high price if things don't go well. These young men and these young women are our fellow citizens. They're fighting an enemy that doesn't hesitate to seek sanctuary in civilian homes or in sacred places. They're fighting this war in a place where they're not always welcome, even as they're defending the rights of the people who are there that they're there to protect. And at home, their families, so many of them working class, from the small towns of the deep piney woods of the South, or the flinty ridges of New England, or the working class environment of the great state of Texas, or the deep, rich, fertile soil of my native Great Plains and my adopted home in Montana, the barrios of East Los Angeles, and the farmland of Wisconsin. At home, these families of these young men and women wait by the phone and hope that it will never ring, or dread the arrival of a military vehicle in the driveway in the middle of the night or early in the morning, bringing unbearable news. These young men and women, our fellow citizens, have volunteered for this duty. And when I go to Walter Reed on personal visits and go into the rooms where somebody has suffered a traumatic head wound or has lost a limb, or maybe two, there are almost always two common experiences. The young warrior will say, "I can't wait to get repaired, sir, so I can go back to my outfit." And the family, the girlfriend, the wife, the children, the mother or the dad, will sit at the foot of the bed with a mixture of pride, bewilderment, and concern that outside of that room, the rest of America is going about its business without really acknowledging the sacrifice that they're making. So a place to begin this dialogue, it seems to me, is for all of us. And in Texas, I don't have to preach the sermon, I know, but for all of us, to think more actively every day about reaching out to those families in our communities and letting them know that we're there for them, and that if we can help in some way, it's the least that we can do. Because in America now, every family has a choice to send or not to send a young person into uniform. And no democratic republic can be true to itself if we are divided between those in uniform and those in civilian clothing without connective tissue between them. So however you feel about these efforts in Iraq or in Afghanistan, betrayed, ambivalent, supportive, we have a common obligation to honor those people who put on the uniform and risk their lives in the service of their country. We honor the warriors, whatever the warfare. I say that in part because I think it is a critically important message to be sending to a new generation of young Americans, many of whom are just across the street in this campus or in other institutions of higher learning, who don't have to make those choices and who may not be thinking about the place of public service in their lives. These are young people who have grown up with a different notion of what the world is all about. For too many of them, their world can be found in the small screen of a laptop computer or on a PDA. They spend a good part of their day text messaging or twittering or tweeping to their friends, short bursts of communication that may be, in fact, meaningful to them, but very often is little more than a distraction. And when I go before these young audiences these days, I say to them, I never expected to see a transformational technology with the sweeping powers of the internet. I wish I were 20 years younger for a lot of reasons, but one of them is I would like to see the evolution of this as it continues. In my business, it is invaluable. The speed with which we can reach distant audiences, retrieve information, the impact that it's had on the world of medical research and medical communication, the enormous tool it has become for commerce, the place that it has taken in our lives so swiftly, which is so important. But for all of its power, you cannot eliminate global poverty by hitting the delete button. We won't change global warming by hitting backspace. It will do us little good to wire the world if we short-circuit our souls. We must always remember that our place in this too brief time that we have on this precious planet will be measured by the contributions that we make not just to our self-interest, but to each other. 100 years from now, when historians look back on this turbulent time, which is still unresolved and the end game is not clear, they'll make a judgment not just about President Barack Obama or Speaker Pelosi or Senator Harry Reid or the Republican counterparts in the Congress. They'll make a judgment about each of us. We're being measured as well during this time. And we cannot pretend that a year from now we'll go back to the way the things were before. There's going to be a new normal, and how we define that new normal really will depend on the rest of us. Now, we've been here before. I've written 2 generational books. Mr. Temple referred to the greatest generation, but I also wrote a book called Boom, about the 1960s. And when I looked at 1968, and writing the book in 1967, and realized that 40 years would have passed by the time the book was finished, I would say aloud to myself periodically during the day, my God, how did we survive that? How did we get through it? I was a young reporter racing across the country at the time, based in California, dealing with the consequences of the war in Vietnam, the upheaval in the urban areas, the great clashes that were going on within families about the place of institutions and the place of the American way of life, the introduction of rampant drug use, but at the same time, in the American South, one of the great moral figures of our time, Dr. Martin Luther King, steadily and purposefully, in the most nonviolent fashion, was leading what can be described as no less than a crusade to liberate all of America from the strictures of segregation, not just Black America. He did it with a combination of eloquence, physical bravery, and a determination that whatever God had in store for him, he would leave his mark on this country every day. We had in the political arena at the same time the man for whom this library is named, Lyndon Johnson, who, when you look at the videotapes here and remember the enormous social progress that he initiated and changed this country, the great ordeal of Vietnam, the passion that he brought to the idea of public service, the challenges within his own party from Eugene McCarthy and then from Bobby Kennedy, the deep division within the young people of this country, many of whom were burning their draft cards and refusing to go to Vietnam, and what was too often overlooked were those who didn't have the sanctuary of a college deferment, who took off their hard hats and put on helmets and enlisted and did go to Vietnam and serve their country. The utter turmoil of that time seemed as if we would not ever emerge from it. Dr. King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, President Johnson decided not to run for re-election. We had full-scale riots in the streets of Chicago, and out of the South, an unalloyed racist and bigot tried to set the flames of violence afire across this country, George Corley Wallace, saying, if you sit down in front of my limousine, it'll be the last one you sit down in front of. And then the election of Richard Nixon, who promised to bring everyone together and instead gave the country Watergate and an extension for several more years of Vietnam. But somehow we managed to prevail. Somehow we moved forward as a country. We found ways that we could advance our common interest. Not always perfect, but we advanced as a nation haltingly. But there were consequences for it. From a political point of view, the great lesson of the 1960s was that everyone began to understand that the personal could be political. So they began to organize themselves around very narrow interest. And that became the litmus test for the judgment of people who came to the country asking to be elected to high or even low office. If you were a Republican, you had to be absolutely unconditionally opposed to abortion, whatever the circumstances. You had to be absolutely unconditionally pro-gun, whatever the circumstances. If you were a Democrat, you had to be absolutely unconditionally pro-choice and anti-gun. And the checklist goes on. And the country, struggling forward, in many ways, was at war with itself. And the consequences of that on our political system are just now beginning to be healed, we hope. 3 years ago, I was in Washington for a benefit for the International Rescue Committee, the most effective international refugee organization in the world, probably, made up of Republicans and Democrats alike. Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell serve on the board of observers. I was the co-chair of it at the time, and we had a meeting in Washington at one of the Senate caucus rooms And I was standing there surrounded by the great lines of the United States Senate and the great figures of past Democratic and Republican administrations who were organizing themselves around this common cause of reaching out beyond our borders to those refugees who needed help, when two bright young men came up to me. I recognized the types immediately. I'm not sure where they were from, but I would guess probably from the University of Wisconsin and maybe SMU. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat. You figure out which school they came from. They were plainly very close friends. And they said, Mr. Brokaw, we'd like to talk to you about what it was like here in Washington in the good old days. I think they meant 1996. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, one said to me, well, I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican. He's my best friend, but my boss won't talk to his boss, and his boss won't talk to my boss. But every night, the two of us go to Georgetown, and we drink beer, and we argue politics till 2 in the morning, and we can't wait to get back up here the next day and do the work of this country. But there just is not any dialogue between our bosses. Well, it so happens I had friends from my days in Washington who were there, and I pulled them over, and we began a kind of nostalgic dialogue about what it was like, even in the 1970s, at the height of Watergate. At the end of the day, when the sun would go down, up on the hill, a bottle of bourbon would be uncorked, or you'd go to a dinner party where there would be Republican members of the Judiciary Committee and Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee, and maybe even somebody from Margie Cox's staff, to say nothing of somebody from the White House defending the president and what he had done that day. And it would be spirited, but it would be civil. And people would leave at the end of the evening with a feeling that they had expanded their own horizons or sharpened their own arguments or had, in fact, learned something. That they were all there with one interest in mind, which was to advance the cause of this country and all the people who live within it. That was lost. And it's time to put it back together again. And that's a place where we can all participate. I think the great test of American life is always, metaphorically, who puts their boots on the ground, not afraid to put their hands in the dirt or spend their nights in scary places. I say that in part because I'm often asked, who are the people who most impressed you in your years as a journalist? And I know that they expect me to say President Kennedy, President Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, Dr. King, Bruce Springsteen, Michael Jordan, I've encountered along the way. And that's been part of the thrill of being a journalist, is having a front seat in the front row of a history as it unfolds, and then from time to time being invited into the back room and sharing the thinking of the people who were making the big decisions. But I tell you with all my heart and my mind that the people who've left the biggest impression on me are many whose names I didn't know at the time and whose image linger in my memory. In the American South one night in Americus, Georgia, a nasty, nasty fracas had broken out that threatened to destroy the town. The black community had decided to meet at a funeral home on the edge of their part of Americus. Well, the main street was lined with rednecks with pickaxe handles, shotguns, and weapons in their hands. And the word had gone out of that if any N-word walked that night, they'd be dead by morning. At midnight, the black community came out of the funeral home having had a 3-hour discussion about what they would do next. And they were led by a beautiful 20-year-old woman in a white dress. I can see her now. And I said to her, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm going to march. And I said, my God, aren't you frightened? She said, I'm terrified. I said, why are you going to march? And she said, I have no other choice. And she marched, and thousands more like her, marched. And President Johnson said to the country, "We shall overcome." And it's been an imperfect process, but we are a long way down a road that we didn't expect many of us in this room to find ourselves at this point. I was in Somalia, back in the news again, because of the pirates. The worst place I have ever been in my life. The purest definition of anarchy that you can possibly imagine. Babies dying in the gutter because of starvation. A mindless civil war that has been going on for 20 years now. And one night outside of Mogadishu, I was in a tent, an operating tent, with a young man from Oklahoma who was a surgeon working for Doctors Without Borders. Mortar rounds were landing all around us. And on his operating table was a young Somali tribes girl, couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, who had been badly wounded by fragments from mortar fire. It was 3 a.m. We had no real protection. He was operating by a kerosene lantern. And I said to him, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Oh God, Mr. Brokaw, I ask myself that every morning. I grew up in a really poor family in Oklahoma. I've got a mountain of medical school debt back home. But I figure someday I'll go back to Tulsa and I'll make a lot of money replacing knees and hips. In the meantime, God gave me these abilities, and I'm going to use them as best I can to save lives and to show the rest of the world there are other faces of America besides the one that are too often caricatured." I left there determined to do my job a lot better the next day. When I left Nightly News, I said to everyone, "That's it, guys. Only the Four Seasons for me from now on. No more overnight flights to hellholes around the world." About 4 weeks later, I woke up in a cargo container in the Pakistan earthquake zone, where I had volunteered to go because I was interested in what was going on in Pakistan and remain so to this day. And it was before dawn. I stumbled out to try to find some instant coffee in what passed for the little commissary there in a terribly devastated earthquake area. And a young man who'd come in late the night before and was the bunk above me came out and joined me, and we watched the sun come up. We began to talk and decided that we had a couple of things in common. He too had gone to college on the 6-year plan. We both loved adventurous lives. And I said, "How long have you been here?" And he said, "I've been here 8 months. And when I first got here," he said, "there was no water, there was no food, there were no medical supplies. There were these poor, devastated clay villages on tops of mountains where mothers had been crushed in their homes in the early morning hours because they were cooking breakfast when the earthquake struck. They were paralyzed from the waist down and then shunned by their husbands. And I was leading mule trains with supplies from the United States Army and from the International Red Cross, 5 and 6 hours a day, up rocky trails to try to help some of these people some of the time." And I said, "My God, you must be ready to go home." And he said, "Nope, I'm trying to re-up. This is the most exhilarating experience of my life. I have finally found real meaning in what I am doing. And when I see the joy or just the relief in these families, when I come around the corner with something that they need, it's something I'll remember for the rest of my life." I high-fived him, and I had to move on to go cover the story myself that day. But he lingers with me to this day. And I think he's probably back in this country, and he's a good citizen and maybe even better for what he did. Which brings me, of course, to the underpinning of the greatest generation. The greatest generation was not forged in World War II. It really was shaped by the common experience of the greatest depression this country has ever known and we hope will ever know. The Great Depression of the 1930s, when life was all about sacrifice and deprivation and common cause. when families took in not just relatives, but strangers and gave them food or a bed or made them part of their extended family. In my family, I grew up with those stories because my parents, my mother and dad, who were the greatest models I could ever have, my dad dropped out of school at the age of 10 to go to work on a construction crew because he was a large boy for his size and could drive a team of horses and then learn to operate heavy equipment. And he courted my mother, who was the prettiest girl in the county and the smartest. And her father lost everything they had in the Depression. And when my mother graduated from high school at the age of 16 and wanted to go to college to become a journalist, it was not possible because it cost $100 a year. And her father had gone to work in town selling notions for $0.10 an hour. I never, ever heard my parents complain about their circumstances. Instead, I heard their gales of laughter as they described getting 8 people in a car to go to a movie that cost $0.10 so they could get a free set of dishes. Or come back to somebody's house, not go to a karaoke bar, or even to Guero's. So they could put on a pot of coffee and somebody play the piano and they could dance because they couldn't afford to do anything else. But they never gave up their common dream that life would be better one day, that the country would serve them well if they did their share. And just when there was some hope in their lives, just when there was some hope, their commander-in-chief said to them, "Now you must go thousands of miles across the Pacific and thousands of miles across the Atlantic and fight the 2 greatest military machines that have ever been assembled. You'll do that on 6 of the 7 continents, in all of the seas and the skies above. And the outcome is by no means certain." In 1938, the United States was the 16th military power in the world, behind even Poland. Dwight Eisenhower was still a colonel. And at home, the President of the United States said to those who were left behind, "We'll shut down the production of civilian vehicles and we'll build new war equipment, trucks and tanks and airplanes. We'll design these weapons on the run because there's not a moment to waste." And farm boys who learned how to weld and how to design things on the farm went to work for Boeing and became machinists overnight. Bellhops in Minnesota, a year later, were flying 4-engine bombers over Central Europe. High school dropouts were wading ashore across the Pacific in Marine uniforms. And at home, farmers were growing more and eating less so the troops would have what they needed. Families went without the most basic needs in life because they knew that there was common cause here. And we prevailed. We won the war because of the determination of our leaders, the will of our warriors, and the great alliance that was put together. And we won the war as well because of the genius of our nuclear scientists who designed the greatest weapon known to mankind and then had grave reservations about its future use. And when the war was over, it would have been easy enough for these young men and women who had been through so much to just put down their arms and say, "Okay, I've done my share. I'm going home, I'm just going to worry about me." They didn't do that. They came back here to Texas especially, California and Florida, Sun Belt states, where they built them to proportions that no one could have imagined. And they went to college in record numbers because Congress, in its enlightened way, had passed the GI Bill. And we created almost overnight an educated middle class in this country. They not only went to college in record numbers, they got married in record numbers. They gave us new industries and new art, new science. And they never stopped giving back. I think looking out across this audience, I can see some of my generation, the children of the 50s. And we knew wherever we lived in America, when you wanted to get something done, you went to the American Legion, or to the auxiliary, or to the vets. Or you went to the car dealer down the street who had been in the war but never talked about it. And he was happy to sign a check for a Boy Scout trooper or Girl Scout trooper for the baseball team. And they ran for city council, they ran for county commission, state legislature, governor, senator, president of the United States. They were active on the school board or in their temple or at their church. Wherever there was something needed to be done, this generation stepped forward. They weren't perfect by any means. Too many of them were slow to recognize the need for racial equality in America, or to acknowledge once they got home that their wives and sisters and the other women in America had kept the place running and deserved to step up beside them. But when they got it, they moved on. And we are the beneficiaries of that. And when I wrote the book, and it began really on the 40th anniversary of D-Day when I walked onto the beach at Normandy with two members of the Big Red One who had landed in the first wave and began to speak softly about what they'd gone through. And as I listened to them and looked at their wives off to the side, clutching their handbags with their plastic kerchiefs over their head because they'd had their permanents done that morning, I thought, my God, these are the people who raised me. And that's how it began. I had a terrible time pulling the stories out of these veterans. They were all so modest and humble. Not one of them stepped forward and said, boy, you got to hear my story. I've got the best story. They'd say instead, you don't want to write about me. You write about my buddy who didn't come back and what his family went through. Or my buddy who did come back, but he was so heroic, and you can't believe what he's done now. I'm just so proud to have served with him. I got the book done in 1998, and in a way nobody could have anticipated it was a huge hit across America, because what I had done was open a door that no one had thought about opening until that point, and say, in effect, to this country, this way, please, there are some stories that you should hear. And about 6 months after the book was out and a big success, still #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, one of the principals in the book came to me and said, you know, I'm glad to be a part of that book, I guess. I had some reservations, but he said, there's a story I didn't tell you. I said, well, thank you. I mean, the book is now out. Why didn't you tell? Well, he said, it just seemed like bragging. I said, what's the story? And he said, well, you remember, I described to you how I grew up in the small town in Kansas. My family lived in the basement of our house and rented out the upper floors because we were so poor. Then I went to the University of Kansas on an athletic scholarship. He said, I was a 3-sport athlete, basketball, track, and football. Then I enlisted in the 10th Mountain Division. And the day after Roosevelt died, and he was my hero, I was a Democrat then, I led an assault on a German machine gun position in central Italy in the mountains. And he was so gravely wounded, his fellow soldiers thought he would never live all the way down the mountain, and they were sure he would never walk again. But he had an indomitable will that the rest of us all have come to know over the years. And he was shipped to a veterans hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan. And there he found himself in bed next to a tiny Japanese-American citizen who was missing an arm. He'd grown up on Honolulu, on Hawaii. His family had been there for 60 years. And when Pearl Harbor happened, he had rushed down to the harbor to treat his fellow American citizens with Red Cross training that he'd gotten in first aid, cursing at the Jap Zeros flying overhead. Then when he began to hear that his cousins and aunts and uncles on the mainland were being shipped off to internment camps, he didn't become bitter in protest. Instead, he enlisted in the 442nd, which became the most heavily decorated combat battalion, Southern Europe, all Nisei, all Japanese American, because segregation was still the order of the day. And he saved a Texas National Guard outfit in heavy battle, almost single-handedly. Should have been awarded the Medal of Honor at that time, but he was Japanese American. So he got only the Silver Star. That was later corrected. In the third bed was a young man of influence and political connections in the Detroit area from a wealthy family who could have avoided combat altogether, but instead he landed on Utah Beach, and he too was gravely wounded. And these three new friends from such disparate backgrounds would lie awake at night and talk about what they were going to do with their lives. And after 3 months, they had come to a common conclusion. They would go home, but public service would always be a part of their lives. And they had a reunion in the United States Senate. Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, Senator Danny Inouye of Hawaii, and the late Phil Hart, who was known as the conscience of the Senate. The Hart Office Building is named after him, the Senate Office Building. In so many ways, those men, I thought, were emblematic of that time. Came from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, but had common cause, and then had common dreams about what they could do for their country. We didn't leave those kinds of dreams on the shores of Anzio or Normandy. It's always been part of our DNA, part of the fiber of who we are. In the darkest days of 1968, when it seemed the country was coming apart, the wheels were coming off, that we would never be who we were before, suddenly the nation was riveted by something that was going on in Cape Canaveral, Florida. 3 astronauts were preparing to make the first rendezvous with the moon to prepare for a moon manned landing. NASA had heard that the Russians were trying to get there first. So these 3 astronauts had their heads down and were working feverishly all that long year. One of them was Jim Lovell, who later became famous as Tom Hanks. And gave us that memorable phrase, "Houston, we have a problem." Jim Lovell had grown up in Milwaukee, the son of a single mother who lived in an apartment so small it had only a Murphy bed, but he had big dreams. He wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and he wanted to go into space. And he'd realized the first dream, became a Navy test pilot, and then he was in the astronaut corps, and now he was about to go into space. And as he stood the gangplank leading into the space capsule, the morning of the launch, 2 days before Christmas 1968, he looked down the causeway at 4 in the morning, and he could see the lights of the press cars coming. And he said to himself, "My God, they're serious. We're going to the moon." And he got into the space capsule, and they launched. And they went around the Earth in a rapid orbit, high velocity, and took off for the moon, 240,000 miles out there. And when they got into this deep, inky void, they radioed Houston and said, "We think we're here, but we don't see the moon." Houston fired a series of small rockets, tipped the spacecraft over, and there for the first time, man is looking at the backside of the lunar surface. Gray, lifeless, and foreboding. Large craters, no sign of life ever having existed there. They've pasted themselves now against the portholes. Imagine this. They've dropped the flight plan, and they're drifting by the backside of the moon. And when they emerge from the far edge, they see something else in the sea of deep darkness. One object, small, beautiful orb with a white filigree of clouds, deep blue of the oceans, the rust brown of the arid areas, the deep green of the rainforest, and the crystal white of the ice caps. It was Mother Earth. And Jim Lovell put up his thumb, and he could hide the entire Earth behind his thumb. And he told me 2 summers ago in Chicago, it gave him a perspective that he's kept for the rest of his life. He said to himself, "That's our spaceship. We're all in this together." And then the astronauts did something quite remarkable. They were broadcasting to the entire world, and they read from Genesis, chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. In the beginning, God created the earth, concluding with, and God saw that it was good. And they had a trouble-free return to earth, and there was a great outpouring of celebration and gratitude on people from around the world saying, "You've given us hope again, and we can go on from here." And when that picture, which has become one of the iconic images of our time, was brought back, one of the true intellectual hippies, and that is not an oxymoron, by the name of Stuart Brand, who had advanced degrees from Stanford and had produced something called the Whole Earth Catalog. Some of you will remember it was kind of a rough paper, large book that most people kept on their coffee table because they didn't know what to do with the things that were in it. Hand plows and composters and rubber boots, and to make life on the commune easier. Stuart Brand had always wanted to know what Earth looked like from space. So he took that iconic image and he put it on the back of the Whole Earth Catalog. And in those days, one of the great catchphrases of the time was, "Get it together." Stuart had a caption for that photograph. It was, "We can't put it together. It is together." And when I interviewed him on a wharf hard by the Sausalito houseboat colony where he continues to live, I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, "It's not what divides us that counts. It's what connects us." I think that may be an appropriate new phrase for us to add at this time. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. This is not a cycle, it's a reset. And it's not what divides us that counts. It's what connects us. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Tom Brokaw, I think I can speak for everyone in this room to say you've given us a captivating evening with some compelling stories. I don't know exactly what we expected from you this evening, but we had very high and great expectations. And it's not polite flattery at all when I say you vastly exceeded those expectations, and we appreciate you being here. Mr. Brokaw has agreed to take a few questions. If there are people in the audience that would like to pose questions, there are a microphone in each of the aisles. And if you'll just go to the microphone and pose a question, I hope you won't get up and filibuster, but if you have a question or two, Mr. Brokaw will take them.
Thank you, Larry. It goes without saying, if you have answers instead of questions, I'd be grateful for that as well. Let's start over here, and then we'll go over here, okay?
Do you feel that the 24-hour news networks that are so prevalent now are greatly contributing to the divisiveness in this country?
That's the second most often asked question that I get. Here's what I think. I think we're better served to have many more sources of information, whether it's the internet or cable or any other number of outlets that are now existing. But you and I have a role in determining what we watch. I have a tool at home that some of you may not have. It's called a remote control. It's got a mute button on it. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than hitting that mute button from time to time. So I really believe that it's the obligation of casual viewers or interested citizens to help sort all this out. It's not going to go away. In many ways, this is an extension of the environment that existed in the 20s and 30s, the 40s and 50s with tabloid newspapers. Most major cities had a lot of them with screaming headlines, and they were quite divisive. If you go back to the early days of our constitutional debate in this country, Thomas Paine and the pamphleteers were standing on the street corners yelling out their strong feelings. If you look at the history of journalism during the days of the Civil War, for example, the kinds of things that were written about Abraham Lincoln were very scurrilous. But we ought not to be a nation of lemmings. We have to bring our active intelligence to what we're seeing and what we're hearing and make judgments about what's worth hearing and what's not worth hearing. So I really think in a country that thrives on free expression, it's better to have more, not less. As enraged as I get, just as you do, with some of what I come to hear from time to time.
Hi, Mr. Brokaw. Thanks for your beautiful remarks. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about your parents and the hopefulness that they carried in their heart, along with perhaps a sense of being able to live in the moment and enjoy what they had. I work in financial services, and I never cease to be amazed at how sometimes the wealthiest of my clients are the least happy. And I was just wondering if you could share some of their remarkable ability to stay present in the moment and also carry hope in their heart.
I was talking to someone today about just that, and I always remember a friend of mine when I got to a certain stage in life where I could afford to do things I never had anticipated. He was a successful lawyer in California. Same thing. We were in London with our children. We agreed to meet at the Connaught Hotel for Sunday lunch. The bill was astronomical. We didn't flinch. We pretended as if it was not having any impact on us whatsoever. As we put our credit cards onto the table and signed it, he looked up at me and he burst out laughing and he said, "Were you ever happier than when you could just afford pizza on Sunday nights and maybe a six-pack?" And I laughed and said, "No, I don't think I have ever been happier than that." I think we're going through a difficult time in terms of how we're trying to come to grips with the meaning of wealth. And obviously there are some pretty horrendous examples of people abusing the accumulation of wealth by taking advantage of systems and opportunities, and there was too little oversight. I don't think we ought to go back to, or no one is suggesting that we're going to live in sackcloth and ashes. There's no question about that. But I think part of the dialogue that we should be having is what's appropriate. If you look at the kinds of homes that have been built across America in the last 10, 15 years, these enormous mansions, way out of proportion to the needs of families, and they become kinds of, in some cases, kind of blights on the landscape. We ought to be thinking more carefully about what is the nature of home construction, especially at a time when we're trying to save energy, and that ought to be an appropriate debate. But we ought not to also just be beating up on people because they like to make money. That's always going to be a part of who we are, and it should be. It helps the whole wheel go around in this country. I saw a very successful Wall Street investor the other day, and he said, "I'm feeling being beat up on." And I said, "Steve, I have a vague idea of how much you're worth. I don't think you're going to bleed very much. You're going to be okay. You have to understand there's a lot of people out there who are doing the right things. Both members of the family are working, they're paying their mortgages, and they're in danger of losing their jobs, and they look up and some guy on Wall Street and trading in an instrument they've never heard of has taken home $80, $90 million the year before." Well, we need to have that dialogue. We need to have some discussion about what's proportionate and what's not.
My question is similar. You have such insight into what makes a generation great. I'm wondering what you have endeavored to pass on to your children and how you tried to accomplish it.
Well, I was helped in my children's case in part because my wife's parents and my parents grew up in a small town in South Dakota. And when Meredith and I moved on from there and ended up in Los Angeles and Washington and New York, we made a concerted effort every year to send our kids back to South Dakota. So they would spend time with their grandparents. My parents lived in a very modest little home. And my wife's father was a physician, but he always went through life thinking he was going to be broke tomorrow. And so they still talk about it to this day. It resonates in their lives about how modest the circumstances were. Moreover, when they were back in that town, their playmates were people who came from a much different environment than the kids that they went to school with in New York. So we have that conversation constantly in our family. And again, it's not a matter of saying to them, you shouldn't enjoy what you earn or take advantage of the good fortune that I've had, but let's be sensible about it, and let's make sure that it's rewarding, that we're not just spending money because we can. I've collected, as I said at the outset, a number of these little sayings. One of my other favorite sayings is a friend of mine in California who's a very successful businessman, but he grew up very poor and was a rock climber first. And well, I'll tell you who it is. It's Yvon Chouinard. He owns Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company. And he is true to his ethos as long as I've known him. And his saying, especially recently, has been, it's not what we want, it's what we need that counts. And we need to have that discussion within our families and among each other again. So, you know, this is an opportunity for America to have a vibrant dialogue about values and proportion and where we're going to go from here. And we're going to continue to be a very wealthy country, and people are going to continue to have big homes and big yachts and big airplanes. And that's not going to go away, and it shouldn't. But let's talk about proportion and what really counts.
Sorry, I'm too short. Thank you so much for coming. I admire you, and I just love NBC Nightly News, and it's not the same without you. My question is like, whenever the United States first went to war in Iraq, you know, President Bush, he was saying, okay, no, don't sacrifice, sit here and keep on spending and spending, because that's what's going to, you know, do to help the economy and to help the troops. But I just feel that, you know, whenever, like World War II, I always talk about this, like World War II, whenever Franklin Delano Roosevelt was like, you need to sacrifice for our government, sacrifice for our country, sacrifice for our troops, plant victory gardens. I just feel that that's what's lacking with today's generation. And what is it that we can do as far as sacrificing to actually do what my grandmother and grandfather's generation did? Like, what is it that we can actually do to show our support for the troops and actually sacrifice and just come together as a country?
Yeah, I was surprised when President Bush didn't ask more of the country. He had said as he was going out of office, when that was raised with him, he said, it's just another word for more taxation. I didn't want to go there. I think it was almost a spiritual quest that people were looking for. How can we help? How can we do something? You know, I always make the point that I did at the beginning of this lecture about reaching out to military families, and so that they know that we're all in this together in some fashion, that we need to be there for them emotionally. What we need to think about in this country is that when these two wars end, and they will at some point, or wind down a lot, there's going to be a lot of wreckage across America. There are a lot of young people who have come home who are grievously wounded with permanent injuries, psychological or physical, and a lot of them are in small working class towns. And those towns are going to be taking care of these reservists or guardsmen or regular career people for the rest of their lives, because the VA is overburdened in many instances, or the hospital is too far away. That's consequential for the fabric of America. That's a place where young people can start. I think that this generation has enormous potential, and I think a lot of it is already being realized. I'm very heartened by what I see as I go across America into the inner city, or environmental causes, or things that need to be done. The young people who are stepping up. Most colleges and universities, I know this is true at the University of Texas, have got all manner of clubs, you know, or organizations that they're putting together that are organized around public service. Somebody who's had a big impact on the country with young people and even with older people as well is my friend Greg Mortensen, who wrote 3 Cups of Tea. The man who's, that's a perfect example. One guy, you know, came out of the mountains injured, he was taken care of, came back to America and wanted to do something. I didn't know him at the time. He wrote 1,000 letters to celebrities asking for money. We had a mutual friend, so I sent him $100. Now, he writes that in the foreword to the book, that I was the only one who sent $100. My eldest daughter is an emergency room physician in San Francisco. She's worked in Pakistan, she's worked in Africa, she's worked in Thailand. She calls me up regularly to say, it's outrageous you're getting that much attention for $100, Dad.
Well, first I'd just like to thank you for giving this talk tonight and for the 2 books that you've written about 2 of the greatest generations our country's seen. I was wondering the differences in a talk that you give like this and a talk that you would give to undergrads or even high school kids, or people of my generation, so we might have a shot at being in the top 5.
Do I do situational ethics where I change my message depending on the audience? No, I don't. I have 2 commencements coming up this year. I try to do 2 every year, and because it forces me to think about what I believe and what I want young people to hear. And I try not to make them sermons from the Mount. I really try to make them kind of user-friendly. So I'm trying to decide that right now. And one of the things that I have to decide is whether I want to keep going back to the greatest generation theme. Tom Daschle, the former senator from South Dakota, we grew up in the same state, once did a roast of me, and I've been identified with the greatest generation. And he said, there are 2 more books in Brokaw's series. One is, The Greatest Generation says, quit following me around. And The Greatest Generation gets a stop order against Brokaw. So for my commencement address, I'm going to turn it to journalism, about your generation and coming to understand the value of journalism in our culture, not just the mechanics of how we get it, but what it means in our life. Okay?
Let's have 2 more questions.
2 more questions, 1 on each side. Okay.
Mr. Brokaw, thanks again for coming. I really enjoyed your presentation. As a history major here at University of Texas, I found your remarks on the greatest generation and the obstacles they had to overcome extremely interesting. And I was wondering if you could give us a little insight about what you think my generation, one of the greatest obstacles they have to overcome, would possibly be at this current time or in the future.
Well, one of the things I think about your generation is that you have to get out of your comfort zone from time to time. And I don't mean that physically. It doesn't mean you have to go off and risk your life somewhere. I'm talking about the comfort zone even emotionally or mentally. Go find out what it's like to be a member of another group and see if that doesn't expand your own horizons by doing that. And then find an area of particular interest to you. It can be organized around your faith. It can be organized around your own economic philosophy or your aspirations or your avocations. And put together like-minded people and say, where can I have the biggest impact? I'll give you 2 good examples of people that I know who are doing this, young people. There's a woman by the name of Jackie Novogratz who could have made a fortune on Wall Street, really a brilliant financial mind. She's the head of something called the Acumen Fund. It's a microloan fund where she goes off to Africa particularly, but also to the subcontinent. And microloans are one of the ways that we're having some impact on developing nations. Very small loans to enterprising people, and then helping them with advancing their businesses or their agricultural interests or whatever it is. Jackie's on an airplane most of the time, flying off to these godforsaken places because she feels so passionately that that's something she can give back. Another young woman I know came out of Yale at a time when welfare reform kicked in America. And she thought that was a good idea. But she also said there are going to be a lot of people out there who are not going to have the kind of connection that they once had to their welfare caseworkers. They're going to want to know where to go get help. So she has set up something, don't hold me to this, it's the Student Assistant League. And they opened offices in the inner city across America. And they really just hung out a shingle and said, if you need help with social services, we can direct you or help expedite it, or we can be your advocate. So these people who no longer have welfare caseworkers or social workers showing up regularly can go into the storefront office. And these bright young people have on their computers, this is a good example of how to use, where they can go to get food bank help, education help, medical care, whatever. That's a very imaginative way to give back something. And it's become a national network. And that has to be the last question. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I would just say that the selfish wish we all have for ourselves is that you'll continue to chronicle the stories of our time, and we thank you for doing that. That's the end of the evening. We appreciate your coming and being here, and we will look forward to the future Middleton lectures, and good evening.